Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. I'm someone who was old enough to remember when the very first VCR machines went on sale, and your family could buy a VCR machine and then go to the local video rental store and you could hire on VHS cassette your favorite movies, and you could bring them home and you could play them on your VCR machine and watch them on your own television, and it was a pretty big deal. In fact, I remember vividly the very first movie that my family, when I was a kid, ever watched, ever rented and then watched on VHS cassette, and it was a copy of The Return of the Jedi, and it was a pretty special moment. The other thing I remember about that whole era was the video rental store, the place where you rent your VHS cassette tapes from. And in most good video stores, there was always someone behind the counter who could give you some sage advice about what movies were good and what movies weren't good. And maybe if you liked a certain genre, they could recommend a movie that maybe you hadn't watched before. They could tell you things to avoid. Don't watch that film. Or if you're going to watch that film, be wary of this. They were just sort of like a fountain of knowledge about movies and films and even sort of cinema history. And they had interesting trivia that they could share with you. In fact, for a long time in my life, one of my dreams was that one day I would end up owning my own video store, and I'd be that person sitting behind the counter who would be giving out sage advice to people about movies and sharing his own sort of amateur love of films with the general movie-going public at large. Now, obviously, the advent of streaming services put paid to that dream, which is why I'm now on YouTube, the new video store where I get to sit here and share my wisdom. In fact, just let me correct this little background while we're talking about YouTube being the new movie store where I can share my wisdom with you. There we go, that's a little bit better. So gather round, kids, because old Pappy Malone is going to fill your heads with some old-timey wisdom about the moving pictures. Seriously, though, that was what I thought of, and that was sort of my dream, and this is what I think of when I think of what a movie critic should be. I think a movie critic should be someone who is like that person who has this love of film, and when you go to a video rental store, they give you sound advice about movies. You can trust them, they're reliable. You might not agree with everything they say, and you might not like the same genre and style of filmmaking that they do, but you can trust them that even if you don't agree on some of those questions around genre, they'll still give you good advice. They'll still say, hey, if you like this particular type of film, then this movie is good and this movie is bad. Or, if you really want to go and watch this film, here's some things you need to be aware about this film that maybe aren't so good, and here's the things that are good, and maybe they'll drop in lots of little important film trivia and knowledge along the way. And so when I think of a film critic, to me it's like a public version of that sort of video store owner who sits behind the counter and gives you good advice. But the question I have is that really what a film critic is today? Can we actually trust film critics now? Have film critics become unreliable because of the nature of what cinema has now become and the financial interests that are at play and the way those things outwork themselves? You see, if I'm honest, I don't rely on film critics at all anymore. I just, there's one or two who you could say are consistently worth checking out, but by and large, I just don't trust the advice that's given by most film critics. Now, one of the things that happens to me a lot on this channel is I get a lot of people who either post comments or contact me, and they say to me, look, I really appreciate the fact that you're so honest and you just sort of share what you think about movies, You don't tend to go with the flow. Now, obviously that could be a good thing or a bad thing, I guess, depending on which side of the ledger you're sitting on. But I don't really see why I wouldn't be that way. To me, it's just about being honest. And, movies, like a lot of things of this nature, are very subjective in nature. And so, if you disagree with something I've said, or you say, well, how dare he say that movie's good, I think it was really bad, or how dare he say that film is bad, I think it was really good, that, you have a discussion about it and you share why you think I'm wrong. And, no harm, no foul. That's how discussion is supposed to work. And the other thing, of course, is I'm not beholden to any big studio. I don't rely on saying a certain thing to ensure that my financial livelihood remains intact. And I think this is one of the big problems that we now see with the whole realm of movie criticism and movie critics in general. The only time you can probably really rely on what they're saying and trust it is when there's no financial interest in it for them. There's no financial stake in it for them. So small indie films where, they can, I guess, speak their mind a bit more freely, perhaps you can trust the advice. It's a bit more reliable. But a lot of the big cinema movies, the big stuff that's coming out, I don't think you can trust critics. And a good example of this is the brand new Star Wars film, The Last Jedi. if you have a look at Rotten Tomatoes and you have a look at their tomato meter, which tells you, breaks down what the critics' consensus is and what the general viewing public's consensus is, you see something very interesting about this film, The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi, according to Rotten Tomatoes, has a critic approval rating of 93%. Now, 93% is pretty impressive. In fact, if you compare it to, say, something like The Godfather, which is one of the best movies ever made, you'll notice that The Last Jedi has an approval rating that is only 6 percentage points behind The Godfather, which sits on 99% approval according to the critics' consensus. And I think, by the way, The Godfather does deserve that approval rating. Now, maybe we should compare it to something else, because, The Godfather is a pretty unique film. Let's compare it then to something like No Country for Old Men, which is also one of the best films that's ever been made, and it's a more recent release, though. Now, No Country for Old Men has an approval rating, according to the critics, of 93%, which is where our radar should actually start to pop up a little bit and say, hold on a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. Why would The Last Jedi have an approval rating from the critics that is the same as No Country for Old Men and very close to The Godfather? I mean, these are two of the best films that have ever been made. They're in a completely different league to The Last Jedi. So how the heck can The Last Jedi have an approval rating that is equal from the critics to one of the best movies that's ever been made, and have an approval rating that is within the same ballpark, within the same 10 percentage points of one of the best movies ever made? How can that be? Now, maybe you're saying, well, Brendan, that's not really fair. You should compare apples with apples, oranges with oranges. Okay, that's fair enough. Well, let's have a look then at a film that's also, just like The Last Jedi, is a sci-fi fantasy adventure. And also, just like The Last Jedi, it's a second film in a trilogy. And in fact, also just like The Last Jedi, it's a Star Wars movie too. And that movie is The Empire Strikes Back. It has an approval rating from the critics of 94%. That is only 1% higher than what the critics have given to The Last Jedi just a couple of days ago. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all. I don't care who you are and whether you really loved The Last Jedi and thought it was one of the best Star Wars films that's ever been made. There is no way that you can expect me to believe, certainly not with a straight face, that The Last Jedi is in the same league as The Empire Strikes Back, The Godfather, and No Country for Old Men. I'm sorry, that just isn't possible. There are objective standards that we can actually look at and see, particularly around storytelling and filmmaking, where The Last Jedi has failed to live up or even come close to those other films. There's no way that this should be happening with critics' consensus approval ratings. Which is why, for me, I don't think, this is just one example of many that I think you can point to now in the last couple of years, to show why I think critics have become an unreliable measure about whether a film is good or bad. And I think part of the problem here is that, particularly with big cinema, big budget cinema, you now have one corporation, the Disney Corporation, which has a near monopolistic control of big cinema. They own two of the biggest movie-making production companies, franchises, whatever you want to call them, that exist today. So they have Marvel and they have Star Wars, and they are the two big names in mainstream cinema today, and they are churning out a ton of films, or I guess they would call them product. They are churning out a ton of these things. Now, if you're a modern movie critic, you rely on getting early access to those films so that you can release early reviews. I mean, you can't make a lot of money if you're the guy who's publishing your review a week after the film has been released. You also rely on keeping the studios happy so that you can get good access to the actors for interviews, so that you can rub shoulders with the important people. If you were making your own YouTube movie show, then it's really important that your audience knows that you're hanging out with the people making these films, because maybe you're going to get some good tips and gossip, and maybe you're a reliable source of information, because hey, you're always rubbing shoulders with the bigwigs. Big George Lucas and I were always having dinner together. The other night when I was out talking to Kathleen Kennedy, I said, hey, Big K, bring it in for the fist bump. Right? And the viewing public thinks, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. They're a reliable reviewer. They're moving in these circles. They're really important. Now, what that means, though, is to keep staying in those circles and to keep getting access to the film early and to keep being able to have those good interviews that you want to have, then you have to keep the studios happy because they are trying to sell a product. And there's no way that they're going to have people that they're going to give favoritism to who are undermining their market share. People who are going to speak honestly about a film if it's a bad film, and as a result, they don't sell as many tickets. They're not going to favour you because you're undermining their ability to make money. And so that's why I think modern film criticism is such a fraught area now. And so I think the answer to this problem is I still use Rotten Tomatoes, but what I do, interestingly, is I don't look at the critics' consensus as the first place. What I do is I stop and I look first at what the general audience is saying. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the general audience reviews, and by the way, the general audience reviews are a much bigger sample size. You were talking about, for example, a film like The Last Jedi. The critics, there's approximately 297 film critics whose reviews have counted towards giving The Last Jedi that 93%. However, on the user ratings side of the ledger, you were talking about almost 100,000 users. 100,000 people who have gone to see this movie who are not critics who have given their review. It's a much bigger sample size, and bigger sample sizes are always much more reliable at giving you a more accurate picture of what's really going on. And in this case, when you look at the user reviews, what you realize is that only 56% of the general audience think this is a good film. And I think that's probably a pretty fair summation. It does seem it's a 50-50 split on this movie. This is definitely not a great movie. It's certainly not in the league of No Country for Old Men or The Godfather or The Empire Strikes Back. This is definitely not one of the best Star Wars films that's ever been made either. And so I think that 56% is much closer to the truth about this movie. So it seems to me that the video store owner, the guy who sat behind the counter and could give you sage advice about movies, that's not the modern film critic, unfortunately. Instead, it's the ordinary Joe Blow on the street. And so that's why I think when you're checking out these movie review sites to try and figure out, what's good and what's not so good about a movie, the first thing I'd say is make sure you have a look at what the general audience consensus is wherever that's available and see what the general audience is saying about it. That might give you a good indication of where a movie's at. You really do have to double check now, and you cannot take at face value anything that you're being told by modern film critics. And I think that's a real shame. As per usual, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And also, what other ways do you have of finding out information about whether a movie is good or not? When I'm in a movie store, I often flick open the Rotten Tomatoes app and just have a quick look about a movie that I perhaps haven't heard of before to gauge whether I want to spend time and effort and money on watching it. But what are your little tips and tricks that you have for gauging whether a movie is good, bad, or otherwise indifferent? I'd love to be able to produce more of this content. The only way I can keep doing that is with the support of people like you. So I have a Patreon account. If you like the content I'm producing and you want to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon. The link is in the description below, and there is also a link on screen now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.